Good morning, Robert Eade, and this is first in a series of vignettes on the Canadian Constitution, governance model, and what you don't know, but I think you will be happy to find out at the end of the vignette. Now, the first one is about recent events concerning the clerk of the Privy Council, whose title continues, and secretary to the cabinet, which means that he is responsible, accountable, owes his duty to the Privy Council, which he is the clerk of, which is like boss of the employee, and that is part of the executive, and is at the upper tier of the Canadian constitutional totem pole hierarchy power sharing agreement, and he reports to the Governor General as part of the executive. And then the second part, secretary to the cabinet, that's pretty simple. That's the boss of the cabinet, runs the meetings, keeps the papers in order, delegates the jobs. Secretary to the cabinet. It sounds small, but it's big. It's like minister of the cabinet, even though he's not an elected official. He's an employee. However, in a terrible emergency in 1940 was the start of the Second World War. Britain was being attacked. France had been overrun. Europe was a shambles. The Nazis were blitzkrieging like crazy. And Canada was the bulwark against the peril. And they were asked to supply people and munitions, and they nationalized industries. There was a huge undertaking, mobilization for the war. The King, William Lyon Mackenzie King, the Honourable Prime Minister of Canada at the time, decided that he needed all of the resources of Canada put together in a united effort to defend the Commonwealth and the free world. And so he took the opportunity that on January the 1st of 1940, the clerk, a longtime clerk, who had been clerk in 1926 when the famous King-Byng affair, which is when the Governor General said no to this very same William Lyon Mackenzie King when he wanted a dissolution of Parliament that he wasn't entitled to. The Governor General Byng said no, and they went and talked to England. England said no, you do not deserve it. Give it to anyway. So he was defied and very browned off by that, and he kept that in his back pocket until the next occasion came along. And the next occasion came along when on January the 1st of 1940, Le Maire retired. He's gone, 66 years old. Then in February, 12th, I believe, of February, the existing Governor General, who was still very much in charge of everything at that time, while he's shaving, has a heart attack. In the course of a couple of days, he's dead. So now, William Lyon Mackenzie King has no boss. He's got no one to say no to him. And he's got an emergency he's got to handle. So I think quite fittingly he says, okay, I was thinking of putting my friend Heaney in here as clerk, but we've been fighting about money, so how about I combine the jobs of secretary to the cabinet, which is my job, and clerk of the Privy Council, which I need to find someone to fill. And I'll combine those two jobs, and because of the emergency, we can now have all the resources of the civil service under control of the clerk, and all of the things that I have to do on the elected side, legislative, unified. And we can act with one mind, and I think it was a smart thing to do. And so what he put through was an order in council. Now, an order in council is the officers of the day, they get together and they write it down and they say, this is what we're going to do, and it says if it was passed as legislation. It has that much force. And then that's presented to the Governor General, and the signature goes on it, and it's law. Now, in this case, of course, there's Governor General's not there. So this order in council says, notwithstanding what it says in the British North America Act, that the clerk belongs to the Governor General, and it doesn't mention the principal secretary in the Constitution. It didn't even mention the Prime Minister in the Constitution. But regardless of the division and the superiority of the executive branch and the supervisory role of the executive branch, now the key ingredient, the key advisor of the Governor General, the executive, will become under the control of the Prime Minister. Now, was it a good idea then? Yes. Should it have been changed back at the end of the war? Yes. However, as long as nobody abuses their power, and nobody takes advantage of anything, well, you know, we can put up with anything as Canadians. We can put up with people ripping off our oil. We can put up with people charging us too much interest. We can put up with a lot of things as Canadians because we have an abundance and we're very nice people. We're too busy with our lives to worry about the minutiae of all this stuff. However, you may remember there was this House committee asking questions. Testifying was the current clerk of the Privy Council, and they never say the whole thing, clerk of the Privy Council and Secretary of the Cabinet. Go to his website, you'll see the whole thing there, and then go down the bottom. It says enabling legislation. There it will say Order in Council PC 1940, the year -1121. That's the number. Now if you want that, you can get it from me, and it says exactly what I'd said, that these are the and let's merge them together. Completely against the anti-British North America Act, anti-Constitution. It's not legal, but it was necessary, so they did it. So there you saw this clerk testifying in defense of one of his bosses, because this guy is wearing two hats. This guy has two masters. This guy is twin-spirited, and this guy speaks with forked tongue because he's trying to keep his foot in both camps, which is hard, and in a crisis you got to pick a master. So he picked the legislative master, the secretary to the cabinet master, and he said that everything that he did was perfectly legit, acceptable, and okay. Everybody who he knows on his team was doing okay. They, you know, pressure is pressure, but pressure is necessary. You got to speed things up. You got to make sure you keep on track of things. Like if you've been in an organization, or if you've been in a committee where someone's a pesky little turd that doesn't want to cooperate, you know that you have to apply a little bit of motivation. Anyway, so he came on to this committee, and the whole idea of the committee was to say that the Honorable Jody was wrong. That she should have done what she was supposed to do. Like, after all, she did vote for it every step of the way through the approval process and through this deferred prosecution agreements, during sneaking it into the omnibus bill and putting it through so nobody paid attention, knowing full well what it was for. But then she objected when she had to, as boss of the department, tell the prosecutor to, instead of prosecuting, we'll do this. We'll let them off the hook so that they can still qualify for their lifeblood, which is milking the Canadian people by winning contracts from Canadian governments. Like they got a subway or light rail in Ottawa, the same thing in Montreal. It's a Quebec company, but they've spread. The two companies that formed this, SNC, it's an acronym for the three partners, and then Lavalin was their competitor that somehow they outfoxed and amalgamated, were two firms in the hydroelectric plant business. And because we have a lot of our hydro coming from power dams in the rivers and lakes that flow into the Atlantic Ocean and the St. Lawrence River and the Hudson's Bay, that we have a lot of experience in putting these kind of plants together, and so that was their worldwide experience. And then when the the power generation from electrons and from nuclear fusion, I guess, and fission, came along, they became experts in that. So they got contracts all around the world doing that thing, and then more things, infrastructure. They could build anything, and the big projects, and that's them. So it started out with, they gave bribes in a country where you got to give bribes, and then they got caught for that, and then they started, you get away with small things, you get used to doing it, and you do bigger and bigger and bigger. I'm not saying that they gave kickbacks to the Liberal Party. I'm not saying they gave donations that were more than the should. I'm not saying any of that. But the whole mess is about hiding the fact that they snuck an escape route into the back door of the budget omnibus bill, a million things at once. That, they didn't say, we want to have a deferred prosecution agreement as part of the Canadian law, and we're having a bill, and we're going to vote on it once, two, three times, and it's going to the Senate 1, 2, 3 times, and it's going to go to the Governor General. It's approved, right, like normal, everything. No, they snuck it in. So it's in effect, and someone will take advantage of it first. It was supposed to be SNC Lavalin. Anyway, so it's getting long in the tooth. What we're saying now is that the clerk of the Privy Council is relied on to be reliable, to be trustworthy, to be honest, to be Canadian, to do the right thing the first time without question. And that time when he testified, he was not being truthful. Nobody even asked him what his full title was and what his full responsibility was and who's his number one boss. Now, I understand that this coming up week, he's going to testify again. So you got NDP members, you got Liberal members, you got Conservative Party members, and you got, I think I saw Elizabeth May ask a question there at the very end the other day. And somebody else who says he got kicked out of a party, so now he's a member of the CCF now. And for the first time in 50 years, they have a question to ask in a committee. So that's great fun that they're having at the expense of everybody who doesn't know what they're talking about. So here's the thing that you didn't know that you didn't know. The clerk of the Privy Council should not be under the control of the Prime Minister. The clerk of the Privy Council should be under the control and responsible to the Governor General. Now, we have to have a Governor General who's much more than a pretty face. We had a couple of beautiful girls from the CBC that could speak both languages and had ethnic blah, blah, blah tokenism in them. And there was an incident, though, when we could have really seen what the Governor General's job was. Actually, 3 of them, involving the previous Prime Minister, the Honourable Stephen Harper. Now, the Honourable Stephen Harper had just brought out a bill saying we're going to have fixed-term elections. And then things were going against him because he had a minority government. And he said, well, okay, I think it's just to my advantage because it was the financial crisis. You know, everything fell apart in late 2008. He says, I think we could call an early election because he knew the longer it went that it would be worse for him. So he called an early election. But, of course, in order to get an election, he's got to get a dissolution from the Governor General. He just put through a bill like 6 months before saying, no, it's a fixed date. So now he's got to stick handle this. And, of course, he's sitting there with the clerk of the Privy Council talking to the Governor General about how it would be okay. So she grants the dissolution. We have an election. Now the election brings back a minority again. So he's in a real pickle here because he's got a new election, he's got a new mandate, but he still doesn't have enough seats to carry everything in the event there's a bad thing that happens. Now, these guys on the other side, they're not stupid. So they wait for a little while, and then they say, well, you know what? If we all banded together, we could have a coalition. We could go to the Governor General and say, we have more seats than he does, so give us power. So he scratches his head. Heaven's sakes, there's an election, or there's an Olympics coming up in Canada that he wants to be boss of, and he can't have this happen. So this is another constitutional conference that you didn't know about, or crisis you didn't know about. So he goes there with the clerk of the Privy Council to the governor. And there's an article here that I was looking at a few minutes ago from, it's on my blog, that was written by Mr. Volpe. And the date of it is December the 5th, 2008. And Clerk of the Privy Council, Kevin Lynch, Governor General's Secretary, Sheila Marie Cook, Miss Jean, Mr. Harper, gathered in the same room that the famous King Byng decision was made. So you can look at it, but I think it's beautiful here. And there's just the 4 of them. The Clerk of the Privy Council and Mr. Harper. So who's the clerk working for? It's Harper, obviously, the legislative secretary to the cabinet. And Ms. Young and her bought and paid for independent constitutional expert, Mr. Peter Hogg. Now, why is the Governor General in this ultimate crisis of whether Mr. Harper's going to get kicked out and this coalition of opposition is going to come in to take over from him, perfectly legally according to the Constitution? How is she going to make a decision when the advice that she's getting is coming from an outsider, and the person who's the most expert, the clerk of the Privy Council, sitting on the other side of the table, is telling her to go ahead and do what Mr. Harper wants? Now, I didn't like it at the time. I got it on my blog and said how terrible it was, and how we really needed to have a Governor General with a mandate to exercise the powers that are given to that office. We have a system in Canada that's called similar in principle to the United Kingdom. The difference principally is that we have this interim level. We have an executive, a local executive, the Governor General's office. The executive in Britain is their cabinet, which is their elected cabinet, but they're the boss. They're the imperial government. They're running the whole thing from there, and the Queen and the Prime Minister, they talk. In this case, the Governor General is supposed to be standing in for the Queen. Supposed to be standing in for peace, order, and good government. Supposed to be standing in for the best interest of you and me. And the Governor General is supposed to do the first thing the right time. The Governor General should be expert in history, expert in Constitution, expert in everything. Not a pretty face, not a nice guy who will do what you say, not a nice guy who will go glad-handing around with vice-regal robes on and live in a nice place and have a huge job fee and pension forever. No, it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be someone who's in a position to say no, who that when the time comes, a bill he doesn't like, can say, you know what? This isn't worthy of royal assent. I'm going to withhold royal assent. Go back and do it again. Get rid of Clause 9, 7, 13, 42. Governor General cannot initiate anything. He just has the power, or she, that officer, has the position to say yes, no, or put it on hold. It's called reservation. Now, in the old days, it was reserved, send it to the Crown for the Crown and the Privy Council in England to have a look at. No, I think we'd have a referendum on it. If the Governor General just cannot make up his mind and say, well, you know what, I'm not going to cancel it, but I'm going to put it on hold, and we'll have referendum just like we did in 1992 on this issue, and put the bill out, and everybody can vote, and if we get whatever the amount is, I think it should be a minimum of 60%. I like 2/3. Then you got 2 to 1. It's a clear majority. 50% plus 1 is another thing. I'll give you a whole video on that. Now I see I'm at 15 minutes. This has flown by like crazy. However, the clerk of the Privy Council needs to be asked the question this upcoming Thursday or Wednesday, whenever he's at the very same committee. Who's your boss? Do you work for the Prime Minister, Mr. Margaret's boy Trudeau? Or do you work as part of the executive for the Governor General? And let him explain his 2 hats, his 2 masters, his twin spirit, and his forked tongue. Robert Eade, looking out for you. Walk a kilobyte or 2 in my moccasins. See you later.